Hello, and welcome to Breast Cancer Conversations, a podcast brought to you by survivingbreastcancer.org. I am Laura Carfang, breast cancer survivor and founder of survivingbreastcancer.org, a nonprofit organization providing community, education, and resources to empower those diagnosed with breast cancer and their caregivers from day one and beyond. Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Breast Cancer Conversations. I am so glad you are here because today I am joined with Dr. Evan Garfein. Dr. Garfein is the chief of the Division of Plastic Surgery at Montefiore Medical Center and a professor of surgery at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He is a board-certified plastic surgeon and has authored over 60 peer-reviewed publications and holds 3 biomedical patents. Dr. Garfein was instrumental in authoring a New York state law addressing inequality in breast reconstruction. He earned his undergraduate degree from Princeton, his medical degree from Columbia, completed his plastic surgery residency at Harvard, a microsurgery fellowship at NYU, and also holds an MBA from Columbia Business School. Welcome to the conversation. Not only are we freaking out that we've been diagnosed with breast cancer, but then, yes, we want to get it out of our bodies immediately. But then, of course, the next question that we have is what next? How is this going to leave me physically, as well as emotionally and mentally, understanding that a part of our body is being amputated, and the reconstruction is a choice that we have. We can choose to have reconstruction, and there's so many great advancements and options for us these days, which is amazing. And there's also options where we can choose to go aesthetically flat as well, and we don't have to go and have breast implants or deep flap surgery, et cetera. So there's a lot out there. There's a lot for us to talk about, and a lot of considerations that I think a lot of times we are asked to make these decisions in a very short period of time. So, I just go back to, it has nothing like choosing college, but it's like, oh my gosh, how am I supposed to know what I want to do with the rest of my life and choose where I go to school, right? And so it's like, okay, we want to get the cancer out, and how am I supposed to choose what type of surgery I want? So that's where we're going to dive in today. I will turn things over to you so you can introduce yourself and give us a little bit of your background.
Yeah, Laura, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. This is one of the issues in plastic surgery and reconstructive surgery that's very close to me, my interest clinically, and I think it's super important. So I'll give you a little bit of my background. I went to medical school here in New York City, and then went up to Boston to the Brigham and Women's Hospital for general surgery, and then Harvard for plastic surgery. And then I came back to New York for microsurgery training at NYU, and I've been at Montefiore since 2008. And along that journey, I was just talking to some residents the other day, and they said, well, hey, Dr. Garfein, how do you decide to be a plastic surgeon? Have you always wanted to be a plastic surgeon? And I said, no, I actually, when I went from medical school up to Boston, it was the only area of surgery that I definitely knew I was not going to go into. I thought I was going to be a cardiac surgeon or a vascular surgeon. And they said, well, what made you change your mind? I said, well, I did an operation one day as a junior resident with a great surgeon named Carl Brewing, who's now up at Brown University Medical Center. And it was a breast reconstruction after mastectomy. And I was totally amazed. I had never seen it before. And I remember rounding on the patient the next morning at 5:15. And this patient was just so incredibly grateful that after the surgical trauma and the emotional trauma of a bilateral mastectomy, she woke up with 2 breasts. And it just meant so much. It was such a powerful moment that I decided that that's sort of what I wanted to do for my career. And so breast reconstruction was sort of there at the very beginning of this journey for me as a plastic surgeon. And that continues to this day.
Incredible. And you're absolutely right. When we wake up from surgery, you're just like, I don't know what I'm going to expect. You have probably multiple drains, you're bandaged, you're going to be black and blue. But to know that you have had, this reconstruction and you feel somewhat whole, even though there's still a long road of recovery, is really impactful. So thank you for sharing that. I'm based in Boston as well, so I'm glad that you got to spend some time in this neck of the woods as well.
Yeah, I miss it.
So you were talking a little bit about how we approach the patient when they are going through so much trauma and fear and anxiety about the unknown. For myself, I've never had a surgery before. I was pretty healthy outside of the cancer just showing up one day. And so I'd never broken any bones, never really been in the hospital. And it was eye-opening to me that, up until that point, I would always go to the hospital or see my primary care and, blood work always looked good. I was pretty healthy. And they always, if I did get sick, there was medicine to fix it. And so it really dawned on me that once I had cancer, it was not a perfect science. And there wasn't always necessarily an answer to quote unquote fix it or get better. And that was really eye-opening to me, especially like living such a healthy, young life at the time. And so to find out that, okay, we're going to try some chemotherapy, we're going to try some radiation, we're going to try all of these things, and we're hoping for the best possible outcome. But at the same time, too, there was very little like guarantee. You can talk to your doctors, you can get second opinions, and you can try and find and make the best choice possible. But when you're approaching patients and you meet with a patient for the first time to discuss the surgical options, can you tell me a little bit about what happens in that consultation?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in your introduction, you touched on a bunch of super important issues that I hope we get to, because I thought many of them were really critical to this whole journey. So when I meet someone who has been recently diagnosed with breast cancer and they come to see me and we're beginning to talk about reconstructive options, I begin every one of those conversations the same way. I say, look, you're going to get through this. I can't promise you that it's going to be easy, but I can promise you a couple of things. I can promise you that I'm never going to abandon you, that I'm going to be with you from start to finish, no matter what happens. And I promise you, I'll never lie to you. I may not always have good news, but I'll never sugarcoat it. You're always going to hear the truth from me. And you never have to be in pain, right? Because those are three things that people are often worried about. And once we get past that, the next thing I say is that the journey you're at the very beginning of has a lot of have tos, right? So we have to get rid of this cancer one way or the other. And there are different ways of doing that, right? There's surgery, there's chemotherapy, there's immunotherapy, there's hormonal therapy, there's radiation therapy, right? So there are lots of levers to pull to get rid of the cancer. And those are all I put under the list of have to. You have to do those things, right? You have to survive this and get to the other side. Then, luckily, I say you're in the office of want to, right? Everything that we're going to talk about is an option for you. You talked about, sort of no reconstruction, and a lot of patients say, hey, what's the simplest, lowest risk, lowest complication type of reconstruction? I said, yeah, just closing the incision, no reconstruction. That is an option, right? And so some women don't even that they think, well, I have to get implants or I have to have autologous tissue using my own tissue, And I said, no, you absolutely don't have to do any of those things. This is the office of want to, not have to. And I think that in and of itself gives a little bit of agency back to patients, right? You're faced with something where your medical oncologist says, well, I think you need chemotherapy. You have to take chemo either up front or afterwards. Or maybe your radiation oncologist says, well, after your lumpectomy, you really need to have radiation treatment. And those things are all sort of, you have to do them. And I sort of like residing selfishly in the realm of want to. I think it's sort of a nice place to be.
Amazing. Amazing. So I really liked how you frame that as well, where it's like the have tos and the want tos. I love how you put the patient at ease immediately. For me, pain was one of my biggest fears. I think even just talking about it to my doctor at the first time, like my eyes got watery. I just had fear of being in pain. And so that reassurance that you're giving someone, especially in this day and age, that they don't have to be in pain is really just like alleviate some of that stress going into it, that we're going to be comfortable. We're going to make the patient as comfortable as possible. And that, it is going to get better. There's light at the end of this tunnel. We run a support group every Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern. And it's amazing that we have women in this support group who are newly diagnosed. And we have women who are 7, 8, 9 years out from their diagnosis, still coming back to get support and still also making decisions about their body image and surgery. We started talking a little bit about the types of surgery. Can we talk about like what options are available for patients and I guess what classifies someone to be eligible for all of these options?
Yeah. So fortunately, and this is another great part of being a reconstructive surgeon, not just for breast, but for everything, we are in an era of increasing possibilities, right? So, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, there was no reconstruction. You had a radical mastectomy. It was incredibly deforming. Everything was removed. It was super radical and the wound was closed and the cure rate was the cure rate. And then there were early breast implants sort of in the 60s and 70s, and then autologous tissue or using your own tissue sort of came about a decade later and started out with tissue from the abdomen in what was called a pedicle tram flap before
Mm.
microsurgery came about, and then an evolution from there. And so now there are probably a dozen or more different ways of reconstructing the breast mound. And it is a conversation, right? It is not like, hey, you need to have X. Of course, there will be patients who are better suited for one modality than another, and there are nuances. And you talked about a woman in your support group who, has decided 5 years after her initial treatment that she wants something different, and that's super common, right? And so part of the algorithm is like, okay, like, first, tell me what you know, because some women come in knowing lots and some women come in knowing very little. And that's okay. Both are fine, but it's important to sort of know where your starting point is. And then we begin the process. And like, it's the same in a lot of ways as when someone comes in for cosmetic surgery. The most important thing is the relationship, right? I
Mm.
have to listen first and sort of register or create a mental file of who you are, what you know, what your goals are, what your priorities are. And then I can tell you from my position sort of what I think the best options might be. But everything has a trade-off, right? Everything, there are pros and cons to everything, whether that's how invasive it is or how permanent it is or what the risks are or how long you're in the hospital or how likely it is to be uncomfortable for you during your recovery. I mean, all these things you drill down and drill down and drill down and drill down. So I think the first step is you have to listen, right? I have to listen. I have to sort of, there are women who come in and say, look, I'm having a bilateral mastectomy in 10 days and my son is getting married in a month. Okay. That's important, right?
Yes.
It was the second thing you mentioned after your mastectomy. So, okay, that's an important thing. Let's not have you be in the hospital for his wedding, right? Like let's create a plan where you're at the wedding with your son. That's important for you. I have, young women who come in or older women who come in and say, look, it's incredibly important for me to regain my feelings of intimacy and sexual health. I don't care what my upfront investment is in the procedure. I want the best possible reconstruction you think I could get. And I say, okay, well, let's talk about those options and everyone in between. And some women say, hey, look, I don't even know why they sent me to you. I don't want any reconstruction. I want the cancer gone. I never liked having breasts anyway. I want to be out of the hospital and through this episode in my life as quickly as possible with the lowest complication risk possible. Okay, great. Nice to meet you. Right. So
Yes.
all those things are in the mix, and that's really fun. That's a great part of this part of my job.
Yeah, so it's like you kind of take on this like consulting role to like really understand what the patient is looking for, then help that patient get the results that they're trying to achieve. That's amazing. For me, it was, and I didn't even know what questions to ask, right? And so I think that's another piece where I encourage everyone to say, well, what haven't I asked? What do I need to know? Because if I've never gone through this before, and I know there's so many great resources now, even on our website, survivingbreastcancer.org, we have questions you can download to ask your surgeon because, again, you don't know what you don't know. And it can be overwhelming. I think we have like 50 plus questions or something. I always tell people like, circle 10, circle 5, circle a couple that like you really want to know and get out of this appointment. And like you mentioned, this is a relationship. It's not really one and done. Develop these really strong connections with your breast surgeon because they are there a lot of times with you in follow up and kind of revision surgeries and with you along the way. So, it's definitely a conversation. One of the questions I wish I had, and we'll get to that point in a moment, was how many surgeries are going to be required? And so, kind of using my own personal experience at the time, I was very athletic. I was very, practicing yoga every day, and my upper body strength was like incredibly important to me. And so, yes, what was the surgery going to be like? But then when would I be able to do a push up again, a pull up again, use my, upper body strength, et cetera. And that was, again, a big defining factor for me because I wanted almost like a one and done type of surgery. I did not understand, if there was going to be a revision and then touch ups and all of these things where sometimes you could have 3 to 5 surgeries afterwards. And so I think these are really important conversations as you're mapping that out to life happening, right? So it's not just like, here's the next 4 weeks of your life. Here's like the next like 12 months of your life, if not longer, giving your body time to heal and be prepared for the next, exchange or other things like that?
Yeah. So lots of people ask that, right? How long is this going to take? When am I going to be? How long is the recovery, right? People
Mm,
ask that all the time. And I say, well, it depends on what you mean by recovery, right? So are you talking about till you're completely healed? A year, right? That's how long it takes a scar to heal completely, right? So a year, they're like, a year? I said, okay, are you talking about when you can go out for dinner? Are you talking about when the drains come out? Are you talking about when the bandages come off? Are you talking, like, tell me what you mean by recovery, because you and I may have a very different definition, or at least there are multiple definitions that would fit for that. So this goes back to, I have to listen to you, right? So what you just said is, I like to do yoga. I want to be active. Your benchmark is a push up. Okay. Now I know something about you, right? And so if I were one way of reconstructing breasts after mastectomy is using your latissimus muscle, as you know, back muscle, and there are some real advantages to it. And we don't do it as much as we used to 20 or 30 years ago because of the rise and commonality of microsurgery. So it's sort of lower down on our list of options, but I still do them, right? In certain people, and we can talk about sort of who would get that. But, it's typically someone who's not a candidate for an abdominal based flap or a thigh based flap, who may have had a tummy tuck earlier in life and that tissue is not available, who maybe has a failed implant based reconstruction from infection or radiation or some other reason, and you need to bring in tissue. Where are you going to bring it from? Okay, well, the back is still an option. However, if you're a swimmer or you love to do yoga and you really need your latissimus muscles to be the fullest you, that's a sacrifice, right? And so we have to talk about that, because that is one of my general frameworks for talking about operations with patients is expense. And I don't mean it financially, I mean it to your body.
mm-hmm.
And so when I talk about options, I'm like, I'm going to list 5 different options for you. And I'm going to list them from least expensive to most expensive. And the most expensive options are options where we do the most surgery, where a different part of your body is affected, where the risk of a complication, not only at the breast mastectomy site is there, but elsewhere, right? Those are expensive. If, I'm very conservative by nature. So when patients come to see me, they are almost uniformly thinking of getting through this, getting to the other side, and success. And so what most patients, not just for breast cancer, but for everything, certainly in aesthetics, is upside. I'm here and I want to be here. And
Mm-hmm.
here could be, I've had 3 kids and my breasts are not where they used to be on my chest and they're deflated and I want to be back to a more youthful breast. Or it can be, I just had a mastectomy and I want a breast mound the way I used to have. So patients almost always focus on upside. My first responsibility to you, to everyone, is I want to think about downside. I want to think, like, if things don't go well, what happens? Because that's in a way more important, right? I expect success, but if you don't plan for a downside, you're sort of setting yourself up, I think, to be surprised in a bad way. So I always talk about that. So yeah, so if you're someone who's really active and function is super important to you, okay, well, let's talk about reconstructive options that don't have the lowest chance of affecting your function.
Yeah. And I think when I was going through all of these choices, I did like the little T chart, right? Like the pros and the cons. I was
Yeah,
talking to my husband about all of this. And I have to say, my decision changed probably like every hour. Some
yeah,
days I felt incredibly empowered and was like, oh my God, just like, let's go flat. I feel good about this. This is my choice. And then the next day I was like, well, I could be a candidate for a double mastectomy and get implants. Like that sounds really great too today. And then, I was actually one of those candidates who was not eligible for a deep flap. And I think that's why they were talking about using part of my back muscle and tissue. And that really freaked me out to all the points that you just mentioned. And just hearing my story in this shorter period of time, kudos to you for how you listen to patients and just able to absorb this and make decisions and support the patient through what's important for them. And to me, that was like an absolute no. And
yeah,
so just the ups and downs and the emotions, but also giving yourself that permission to change your mind all the time leading up into that surgery. And I was very fortunate to have a caregiver and a husband that supported every single decision, regardless of like the mood or what side of the bed I woke up on that day through the end. And so, I know not everyone has that luxury, but I share with people that today you're not doing this for your husband, you're not doing this for your future spouse, your partner. But if you can wake up and look in the mirror at yourself in the mirror and feel like I am making the right decision for me, and I know this is the right one for me, you're going to be successful. Like that's it.
yeah. Now, what I'll mention to you, leading into that, and for your viewers and the people in your support group, I'm sure you've seen this, is this sort of dovetails into why I think it's incredibly, incredibly important to have a plastic surgeon, a reconstructive surgeon involved immediately, right from the get-go. And I'll give you a great example. So I have a close personal friend who was recently diagnosed with breast cancer, and she has small breasts. And so you get diagnosed with breast cancer, your world gets turned upside down, you can't breathe, you're in a panic, you have kids, life goes on, you have a career, all this stuff is happening. And so you try to right the ship as quickly as you can. Okay, well, I'm going to go see my oncologist, and she's going to send me to a breast surgeon, and I'm going to meet with a breast surgeon, and I want this cancer out. That is first on my list, right? Okay. And sometimes the decision is made at that time to go down a path without full information, right? And I get that, right? I get if you're a breast surgeon or you're a medical breast oncologist, your world is curing people of breast cancer, right? And preventing death. And that is super critical and really unfortunately common. And that is your machine. And there are still lots of women in this country. And if we talk about the law, I think this is sort of the genesis of that law. There are still lots of women in this country who start this journey. Reconstruction is like either not talked about or far away. And we started out this conversation by saying, well, the simplest type of reconstruction is no reconstruction, and that's okay. That is okay if you choose it. It's not okay if you don't know that you can get reconstructed. And the other reason why it's so important to have a plastic surgeon, why when women get diagnosed with breast cancer, and it's like every week, unfortunately, someone gets referred to me through outside of the hospital, a friend of a friend or a coworker. I say, look, get going. You don't stick your head in the sand, but you have to talk to a plastic surgeon before you decide on a lumpectomy versus a mastectomy, a bilateral versus a unilateral. You need to have the whole team assembled before you make any decisions, because that will affect, or it can affect, your choices. And so for women with small breasts, for example, who have a relatively big tumor, the last 30 years has witnessed a revolution in survival for women who have breast cancer and undergo lumpectomy and radiation. It's great. It's a miracle in a lot of ways that the survival is so good treating breast cancer in this way. But that's not for everyone. And so I tell patients, if you take a golf ball out of a cantaloupe, it's still a cantaloupe, right? If you take a golf ball out of an orange, like, it's not an orange anymore, right? So the survival may be the same, but that breast is very different, especially when you radiate it. And so if you don't have a plastic surgeon who says, yeah, you could have a lumpectomy and radiation, and your cure rate will probably be the same as it would be after mastectomy and reconstruction, that's correct, but your breast won't be the same. And again, you have to listen to the patient. Some women are like, I don't care. I want day surgery and to be done. Okay, great. Lumpectomy and radiation, super, right? If some women say, hey, look, my sexuality is really important to me, my body self-image is really important to me, whatever, like, then that's not such a good option. And so that's why it's so important. Like, make sure if you get diagnosed with breast cancer, make sure a plastic surgeon is part of your early team.
Excellent, sage advice. And so tell me a little bit more about this bill. So it sounds like this used to not be the norm.
Yeah. So when I was a resident at the Brigham, I was a resident with a really, really smart woman named Caprice. She was Caprice Christian. Now she's Caprice Greenberg. And Caprice did her research. Part of her research during residency was on breast cancer. And I remember reading one of her papers that I thought was super interesting. And if you go back in history to the later part of the 20th century, there was a very important bill passed that I think Al D'Amato, one of the senators from New York, wrote, called the Women's Health and Cancer Rights Act. And what it did was it guaranteed that reconstruction, among other things, it guaranteed that reconstruction would be, after breast cancer surgery, would be covered by all insurances, government insurers, private insurers, everyone. And part of the raison d'etre of the bill was they thought that, like, mostly poor minority women were not getting reconstructed after after breast cancer care. And they thought, well, I'm sure the reason they're not getting reconstructed is because their insurances don't pay for a deep, well, they weren't deep flaps back then, but implants or a tram or a lat or some
Mm-hmm.
other modality. And so they passed this great bill, right? Women's Health and Cancer Rights Act. And then Caprice wrote a paper about 15 years after the bill was passed, and they looked at rates of reconstruction, and they divided it out by race, by socioeconomic group, by education, different ways. And what they found, depressingly, was that it had almost no effect on especially poor minority women. So this paper came out sort of just as I was leaving Boston, coming to New York to start practice. And I remember I had drinks one night with a guy named Gifford Miller, who was a friend of mine from college, who was at the time the speaker of the New York City Council as a really young guy. It was an amazing rise for him. And Gifford said, "Yeah, well, you're starting to work up at Montefiore, which is this giant healthcare system in the Bronx that encompasses some of the poorest zip codes in America. What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, Gifford, I'm really interested in this problem of access to care." And I told him about Caprice's paper. And I said, that just seems crazy to me that, if you're rich and white and you live on the Upper East Side, your likelihood of getting reconstruction after mastectomy is like 50%. And if you're poor and Black and live in the South Bronx, the likelihood that you get reconstructed is like 7%. Like, that's crazy. And he said, "Yeah, like, what do you want to do about it?" And I said, well, I was like super naive. And I was like, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to like go to beauty parlors. I had read like Malcolm Gladwell. I'm like, I'm going to talk at churches and I'm going to go to beauty parlors and community grassroots. And he just looked at me and he's like, that's never going to work.
Mm.
And I said, well, what should I do? And he said, what did you learn from the paper? And I said, well, Caprice learned that the single greatest predictor of getting reconstruction for women who are about to undergo mastectomy was the breast surgeon telling the patient that reconstruction was an option. When I read that, I thought, that is impossible. Like, it can't be so simple, right? Like, and I told Gifford that. He said, well, if that's the greatest predictor of getting reconstruction, just make it a law that you have to tell women that they have this as an option. And so that sort of started this journey. And I met this guy at Montefiore named Don Ashkenaz, who was part of government and community affairs. And I went to see him, and he was a super busy guy, really connected in Albany. And I said, Mr. Ashkenaz, I just started here. I have this idea. And he listened to me. And at first he thought that I was just trying to drum up business. He's like, look, pal, I don't have time for this. But I left something on his desk, and he called me back later that day and he said, this is really important. Let's do this together. And, after a year of writing this bill and talking to people in Albany, we got it passed. And it was the first one in the country on a state level that said, it's a law that if you're being treated for breast cancer, you have to be made aware of your right to have some sort of reconstruction. So we were really happy. And since that time, I think, most of the states now in the country have a similar law on their books. But I think it's really important. And it speaks to the fact that, like, you have to assemble the right team at the beginning of this journey. It's really, really important.
Yeah. No, thank you. And thank you for that really important work starting in New York and having it go into other states. Out of curiosity, was there resistance? It sounds like something as simple as, asking a doctor to add, this question as part of, like, have you fallen recently? Do you feel safe at home? Like all of these checklist things, right? Like, and that this is a right for you. But were there a lot of conversations, I imagine, leading up to like this decision and how you educate the healthcare field?
Well, so here's sort of the problem, right? So Montefiore is like, we provide healthcare to some of the poorest people in America, and we offer sort of the full suite of modern services: radiation, microsurgery, everything, right? And that's great. It's one of the reasons why I think this is still a special place, and that's why I like working here. There are other hospitals in poor areas, not just in New York City, but around the country, where we have 8 plastic surgeons in our division here at Montefiore. If you look at other hospitals in the Bronx, maybe there's one guy who covers part-time, but then has a private practice. And so if the hospital doesn't, if the hospital or these giant health systems now, if they don't invest in having people around who can do this, I get the hesitance on the part of a breast surgeon to mention it. Because if you are at an inner city hospital in most places in this country, and a breast surgeon has a clinic with 40 women who are just diagnosed with breast cancer, and one plastic surgeon shows up every other week for clinic, doesn't do microsurgery, you're not going to say like, hey, let's set you up for reconstruction. It's not going to happen, right? And so what you do is you say, okay, we have to get this cancer out so we can save your life. Let's do a lumpectomy. Let's even a big lumpectomy and radiate you. In 10 years, in 20 years, you're going to be fine. You're going to be cured. Your breast is not going to look so good, but that's as good as we can do. That's the problem, right? The problem is health systems have to invest in like a full suite of services for people who are not all that profitable in a financial sense to take care of. That's okay, right? That's part of our job. That's part of what you buy in society by supporting places like that. You have to offer people sort of a standard basket of goods. Not everyone needs everything. There should be a chicken in every pot. There doesn't have to be a 18-course gourmet meal, but you have to have a chicken, right? And so reconstruction is part of the chicken in every pot for breast cancer.
Yeah, no, that's great. What can organizations like ours do to help women understand that this is their option and their right to know and to explore?
Well, I think just doing what you're doing. Honestly, I think, every day, every year, I think when we talked about the different reconstructive modalities that are available to patients, there are more places that are doing more types of reconstruction. 25 years ago, only the academic places and maybe a couple of others were doing deep flaps, right? I mean, it was super high tech. I was telling someone at the hospital, I said, patients there are a couple places around the country that are doing deeps almost as outpatient, which is pretty amazing, right? And so when I was in training, I used to joke, every time you did a deep flap, you would call the TV station to, do some story on high tech, this crazy new high tech way. It would take all day. The patient would stay in the hospital for a week. And similar to the natural evolution of a lot of surgical technology, we've gotten better and faster, and it's less morbid and more routine. And so your question about what can you do, what can organizations do, just knowledge is power, right? And so if you get diagnosed with breast cancer and you're listening to your podcast, you're going to say like, okay, like one of the questions I'm going to ask my medical oncologist or my breast surgeon is, okay, when can I meet the plastic surgeon? I want to talk to a plastic surgeon before I decide whether I want a mastectomy or a lumpectomy, before I decide unilateral or bilateral, before I decide timing of radiation, like all these things, you need a team. And so
Yeah.
the more complete your team is, the better your decision will be. There's still going to be complications, bumps in the road, whatever, but you have to put together a good team right from the start. And in order to do that, you need to know what your options are.
Yeah. I joke about it, but I was like, I have all these doctors. I have this huge team. I have, doctors in my back pocket in case I needed to pull something out that I didn't know of. I was like, the more people, the more eyes that are looking at my case, I just felt so secure. So
Yeah.
like so many people were supporting me, and, it was kind of a little bit of annoying to like have all of these appointments like all the time during the week. And scheduling could be challenging where, you might go to the hospital to meet with one doctor and then next day a different doctor because we couldn't get 2 appointments on the same day. So there's also, when you were talking about those expenses, right? Not just like the physical, but like, or the financial, but the time expense of trying to make all of these appointments. Hopefully we've come some way with like telemedicine and telehealth where some of these conversations can also happen virtually, or the patient doesn't need to take so much time off from work or find daycare, et cetera. But I loved it. I was like, bring them on. I need more people on my team. So I think that's really sage advice. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like our listeners to know?
No, I mean, I think back to an experience I had with one of my wife's friends who was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she wasn't in New York City last year, and she was living abroad at the time. So I was sort of just acting as like her. I say, like I'm like your rabbi. I like you just call me and we'll talk. I'm not going to care. I'm not going to be the one doing the surgery. You're going to have it done somewhere else. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I tell people like find people who can listen and may not have skin in the game, right? for better or worse, when a patient comes to see me, and I do microsurgery and I do implants, I sort of offer people a full suite. But there, if you go to see a surgeon, and this is not to cast aspersions on anyone, if you go to see a surgeon and all they do is one type of reconstruction, they may be really good at that type of reconstruction, but there's going to be either an implicit bias or a subconscious bias in their advice. And that's okay as long as you recognize it. And so I love having more voices. I tell everyone, you don't have to go sit with 3 different breast surgeons, but I tell people to get at least 2 different opinions from a reconstructive surgeon. See if they're the same. See if you have a different vibe. The relationship
Yeah.
feels different. That's really important, right? If they both say, hey, I would not do implants in your case, I would do autologous tissue, and both say that, okay, that's different from saying, I would do implants, I would do autologous tissue. What do? Get a third opinion, right? So I think loading the boat is really important.
I'm so glad you brought up the second and third opinions. I have to ask you, because we get this question all the time where people get nervous to ask for a second opinion because we don't want to offend you, right? And then what if we decide to go back to you and you think that we cheated on you by asking for a second opinion? Are you going to botch the surgery? Or is there something there's so much fear around getting opinions. If you would just repeat what you said, this is so important.
Yeah. Look, I mean, there's this really, I don't know if it's like an apocryphal story. There's this great story that I heard as a resident about this incredibly sort of conceited, I guess, orthopedic surgeon who once said, if you want as a patient asked him about a second opinion, and he said, if you want a second opinion, ask me twice. And so I thought that was sort of funny. I think second opinions are incredibly important. And I tell patients to get a second opinion. Right. I'm like, look, and it's very common. I hear that a lot. I don't want to offend you. What if I go to see another guy? I'm like, look, that is okay. I'm totally fine with it. I tell people my mother held me a lot as a child. I'm very secure. It's okay if patients don't come to see me. What I want what's best for you. And I want you to be happy. And you have to be comfortable with your decision when you go to sleep that day. And I have to be comfortable with your decision when you go to sleep that day. And if that's something that I can offer and you feel good about it, great. Then I'll do the best I can. If it's not, okay, that's fine too. And so I sort of have luckily I live and work in New York, right? And there are a million really good plastic surgeons and breast surgeons and everything. And so, I am a huge fan of second opinions. I think I've never, ever been sorry that a patient got one, that I sent someone to someone else. If they come back, great. If they don't come back, great. That's not a concern at all. Patients should not worry about that at all. And as a matter of fact, just to bring it from 100,000 feet down to sea level, one of the ways to break the ice, if you're not totally plugged into the medical world, is patients can say, hey, Dr. Garfein, if you weren't doing this surgery, who would you send, your wife to?
Mm-hmm.
Who else would you talk to? And then I'm like, I would go see, Jamie Levine at NYU. I would go see Evan Matros at Memorial. And there are a million great reconstructive surgeons around. It can only help.
Yes, I love that. We're going to have that front and center on repeat. So I think the more we hear that we have permission to do this and that we're not offending everyone, take some time to sink in. And, I think sometimes it's also against our nature to question, especially when you have power dynamic between a half-naked woman and Johnny sitting in front of you and the medical professional. So this is just really, again, goes and supports what we say is that you're entitled and empowered to ask these questions. A lot of our surgeons run in the same circles, find out anyway. So you might as well just have an open conversation with them. So I appreciate that. The last part of my podcast, I love to do something that I'm calling our lightning round, where I ask you just fun questions to kind of get to know you on a human level, if you're okay with that. So don't think too much about it. And if you don't have an answer, you can say pass.
Okay.
So dogs or cats?
Dogs.
Dogs. Awesome. Vacationing on the beach or in the mountains?
Oh, I love both, but I'll go mountains.
Awesome. And I know you're super busy with your practice and surgery, but if you have time to watch Netflix or anything on TV, is there a series or movie that you go to?
New series of New Year of Slow Horses just came out. So I haven't seen it yet, but anyone who hasn't, it's a good one. It's a good one.
Awesome. And last question, outside of reading peer-reviewed medical journals, is there any favorite book or things you love to read in your downtime?
Yeah, I'm finishing. My goal for 2025 was to read Churchill's 6-volume Second World War. So I'm on volume 6. I'm about 3,300 pages into it. So I'll read anything Churchill.
I love it. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us, for sharing your knowledge, and congratulations on the advocacy work that you're doing in legislation and advocating for women's health. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Laura.
Testing 1 2, testing 1 2. He is the chief of the Division of Plastic Surgery at Montefiore. That was like the Italian accent coming out, right? You like that? Montefiore? Montefiore Medical Cancer Center. And thank you, everyone, for listening to our show. I would like to acknowledge that all of the information on our podcast is from personal experiences and is not a substitute for professional medical advice. You should always contact your medical care team. If you are looking for specific topics or would like to be a guest on our show, please feel free to reach out. My email is laura@survivingbreastcancer.org. Our show is made possible by our nonprofit, survivingbreastcancer.org, and by our incredible donors like yourself. You can hop on over to survivingbreastcancer.org to sign up for our mailing list, make a donation, and explore the 400 plus programs we offer each year at survivingbreastcancer.org/events. Until next time, keep on thriving.